Level 1. The Anunnaki Reptilians. Mesopotamia, roughly 6,000 years ago, a civilization appears in the river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, with a sophistication that archaeologists still cannot fully account for. Fully developed writing, advanced mathematics, agricultural systems, and a cosmology so detailed it described the outer planets of our solar system before any telescope existed. And at the center of that cosmology were the Anunnaki. The word translates from ancient Sumerian as those who from heaven to earth came. Cuneiform tablets, thousands of them, describe these beings in relentless physical detail. 8 to 9 feet tall. Skin described as scaled or reptilian in texture. Eyes depicted with elongated vertical pupils and temple carvings across multiple city-states. Eridu, Nippur. They wore what the tablets called gleaming garments and communicated through a language the Sumerians said they were taught, not born knowing. Zecharia Sitchin spent 4 decades translating these texts and concluded that the Anunnaki were extraterrestrial beings who came to Earth to mine gold, using early humans as a labor force they genetically engineered. Mainstream academia has dismissed Sitchin's translations as selective and speculative. Fair enough. But the physical descriptions in the tablets exist independent of his interpretations, and they were carved into stone by a culture with no reason to coordinate a fictional species across hundreds of independent city-states. What fractures the standard archaeological explanation is the timeline. Sumerian civilization does not gradually develop, it erupts. Within a few centuries, a hunter-gatherer society produces legal codes, astronomy, irrigation engineering, and a pantheon of non-human rulers described not as gods in the abstract sense, but as governors, administrators, with schedules, with bureaucracies. The Anunnaki feuded with each other, held territory disputes, issued directives. That is not the behavior of metaphor. Metaphors do not have org charts. Of all 7 types covered here, the Anunnaki represent what might be called the administrative class, beings described not as conquerors, but as architects. What was built after them suggests someone left very specific instructions. Level 2, the Alpha Draconians. A name surfaces in an unexpected place. The testimony of a man named Credo Mutwa, a Zulu shaman and Sanusi, a keeper of oral tradition, born in South Africa in 1921. Mutwa spent decades publicly describing a type of being his culture called the Chitori, translated loosely, children of the serpent, or the dictators. His accounts were specific enough to produce detailed illustrations, and those illustrations were independently compared to descriptions from cultures he had no documented contact with. They matched. What Mutwa described aligns closely with what researchers call the Alpha Draconians, a classification rooted in the hypothesis that a reptilian species originating from the Draco constellation preceded human civilization on Earth by millions of years, not thousands, millions. According to this framework, the Alpha Draconians are the oldest known reptilian type, functioning as something close to a royal or warrior caste. Physically, they are described across multiple independent sources as significantly larger than other reptilian types, often exceeding 12 feet in height, with dark, almost charcoal-scaled skin, large leathery wings in some accounts, and a cranial structure notably different from the others. Their eyes are described consistently as red or orange, with a glow that witnesses across cultures described as producing a specific psychosomatic effect, sudden, overwhelming terror unconnected to any immediate threat. Researchers studying mass animal behavior have noted that certain snake species produce a chemical signal triggering instinctive fear responses in mammals at a neurological level. The implication being that the terror response reported in these accounts might not be emotional. It might be biological. Lieutenant Colonel Philip Corso, a decorated U.S. Army officer who claimed to have worked on recovered extraterrestrial technology after the 1947 Roswell incident, described in his 1997 book a hierarchy among non-human intelligences, with one type described as dominant over others, physically imposing, and connected to what he called ancient agreements, predating any modern government. He did not use the word draconian. He did not need to. If the Anunnaki were administrators, the Alpha Draconians occupy the position above them in every independent classification system that has ever tried to map this, which raises a structural question. Who exactly were the Anunnaki reporting to? Level 3, the Saurians. 66 million years ago, a mass extinction event ended the Cretaceous period and wiped out the non-avian dinosaurs. Established record, not contested. But a small community of paleontologists has quietly raised a question the field has never fully resolved. What happened to the Troodon? Troodon formosus was one of the most neurologically advanced dinosaurs ever documented. Brain-to-body ratio approaching that of modern birds, forward-facing binocular eyes, grasping hands. In 1982, paleontologist Dale Russell at the Canadian Museum of Nature conducted a formal thought experiment, later published in peer-reviewed literature, calculating the trajectory of Troodon's cognitive evolution had the extinction not occurred. His model produced what he called the Dinosauroid, an upright, bipedal, large-brained reptilian being. He built a physical model. It looked disturbingly like descriptions of what researchers call the saurian type of reptilian. Russell was not a fringe figure. His paper was not a joke. It was a legitimate scientific exercise that the field absorbed, debated, and then quietly stopped discussing. The Saurian classification refers to beings described as smaller than the Draconian or Anunnaki types, typically 5 to 6 feet tall, greenish or brownish scaled skin, large dark eyes, slender builds. Critically, they appear almost always in the context of technology rather than authority. Eyewitness accounts from alleged abduction experiences, including the extensively documented cases compiled by researcher David Jacobs at Temple University, describe beings of this type operating equipment, performing biological procedures, functioning in roles that could only be described as scientific or medical. No cultural mythology assigns them kingship. No ancient text calls them rulers. They appear to be operators. Russell's Dinosauroid model was shelved because it made people uncomfortable in ways that were hard to articulate in academic language. A species with 66 million more years of cognitive development than Homo sapiens would be so far beyond our current intelligence that the comparison becomes almost meaningless. We would not be their rivals. We would not even be their concern. We would be something much closer to a research subject. Level 4, the reptilian human hybrids. 43 ancient royal bloodlines. That is the number David Icke cited when he first published his framework in 1998. And it is the number that made everyone stop listening because the claim sounds insane until you map it against something that is not insane at all. The documented historical obsession that ruling dynasties across every continent have had with bloodline purity. Egyptian pharaohs married their sisters. European royal families maintained genealogical records stretching back to beings they explicitly described as non-human in their own founding texts. Mesoamerican priest kings claimed descent from the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl. Japanese imperial lineage traces to a deity described in the Kojiki as a dragon serpent. None of these cultures shared trade routes, language families, or documented contact, and yet all of them independently constructed a mythology in which legitimate rulership descended from a serpentine non-human ancestor. That is not a coincidence requiring a conspiracy to explain. It requires something far simpler and more uncomfortable, a shared observation. The reptilian-human hybrid classification refers to beings existing at the interface between human and reptilian biology, appearing largely human under most conditions, with physiological anomalies that surface under specific circumstances. Researcher Jim Mars documented testimony from multiple independent sources describing the same phenomenon, individuals in positions of institutional power exhibiting behavioral and physiological responses, including vertical pupil dilation and sudden temperature changes in their skin, during periods of high stress or ritual behavior. Mars was a mainstream investigative journalist before he was anything else. His sourcing was meticulous. The fracture in any clean dismissal of this category is genetic. In 2015, a genome sequencing study published in PLOS ONE identified over 145 genes in the human genome, with no traceable evolutionary predecessor, genes that did not exist in any ancestral primate lineage, appearing in the human genetic sequence without a discoverable origin. The researchers noted this. No follow-up study has produced an explanation. Somewhere in that gap between the genes we can account for and the genes we cannot, a different kind of question lives, one that has been living there, unanswered, for as long as we have had the tools to ask it. Level 5, the Inner Earth Reptilian. Admiral Richard Byrd's flight logs from Operation High Jump in 1947 are not classified. They are publicly available in his personal diary, the authenticity of which has been debated but never definitively disproven. Byrd describes flying his aircraft beyond the Antarctic ice shelf and entering a territory that did not appear on any map, populated by a civilization he described as advanced and non-human. He called them the Masters. He returned to Washington and within weeks was reportedly subjected to an intense debriefing by officials he was not permitted to name. He spoke about the experience once, publicly, in a Chilean newspaper interview in 1947. Never mentioned it in any official capacity again. Byrd's account, real or fabricated, sits at the edge of a classification that appears in sources with no connection to each other. Ancient Vedic texts describe the Naga, serpentine beings of immense intelligence who inhabited vast underground kingdoms called Patala and Bilasvarga, cities of light beneath the surface of the earth. The Hopi people of the American Southwest describe emerging from underground chambers guided by beings called the Ant People. The Hopi word used for these beings translates more accurately to scaled people than to any insect. Buddhist texts reference the subterranean kingdom of Agartha, ruled by a being called the King of the World, described in physical terms that do not match any human king. German SS researcher Karl Haushofer mounted two formal expeditions to Tibet in the 1920s and 1930s, specifically searching for an entrance to this underground civilization. That is not mythology. That is documented military funding allocated to find a hole in the ground. Inner Earth reptilians are described across these separate traditions with specific consistent details. They avoid surface light, operating primarily in cavern systems that multiple traditions describe as lit by bioluminescent means. They are reported to be technologically sophisticated in ways that imply a development timeline vastly longer than human civilization. And every tradition that describes them frames their relationship to surface humans not as hostile, but as supervisory, watchful, patient in a way that implies they are not operating on our timescale. Hollow Earth, as physics is not viable. But Hollow Earth as a network of vast natural cavern systems absolutely is. The Lechuguilla cave system in New Mexico alone extends to a mapped depth of over 1,600 feet, with chambers larger than football stadiums, and researchers estimate less than half of it has been explored. What has been down there, uninterrupted, for 66 million years is a question no one in any official capacity appears eager to fund. Level 6, the Sumerian Reptilians. Look at the Dogon people of Mali, an isolated tribe in West Africa with no telescopes, no mathematics beyond basic counting in their documented pre-colonial state, and yet their oral astronomical traditions, recorded by French anthropologists Marcel Griaule and Germain Dieterlen in the 1930s, contained precise knowledge of Sirius B, a white dwarf star, completely invisible to the naked eye, that Western astronomy did not confirm until 1970. The Dogon said they received this information from beings who came from Sirius. They drew the orbital path. They got it right. The Sumerian reptilian classification refers to a type described not in terms of domination or administration, but transmission. These beings appear in the record specifically as teachers, arriving, delivering knowledge, and departing. Ancient Egyptian theology is saturated with Syrian symbolism. Isis was the embodiment of Sirius in Egyptian cosmology, and her imagery combines human and serpentine features in a way Egyptologists have always categorized as symbolic. But the physical descriptions in the pyramid texts, some of the oldest religious writing on Earth, dating to approximately 2400 BCE, describe encounters with beings who arrived from Sirius in terms of physical detail that would be unusual for mythology. Specific bodily dimensions, specific behavioral protocols, specific knowledge exchanges. Mythology tends toward the abstract. These texts read like field notes. Carlos Muñoz Ferrada, a Chilean astronomer who correctly predicted the orbital paths of comets in the 1940s and 1950s with documented precision that baffled his contemporaries, claimed in a 1999 interview that Sirius functions not just as a star, but as a transmission point, a coordinate used by non-terrestrial intelligences for navigation. He died in 2001. His astronomical predictions are on record. His other claims were never followed up by anyone with the equipment to do so. What distinguishes the Syrian reptilian from every other type in this sequence is intent. Every other classification involves beings described as taking something, gold, genetic material, territory, compliance. The Syrian type is described in the record as giving, as instructing, arriving with information, and then leaving. The obvious question, what they expected in return, is the one detail every tradition that mentions them conspicuously omits. Level 7, the Shapeshifters. In 1961, Robert F. Kennedy sat across a table from J. Edgar Hoover and described a meeting he'd had the previous week with an intermediary for the Cuban government. He described the meeting in detail. Then he stopped, mid-sentence, looked at Hoover, and said something that appeared in a declassified FBI memorandum filed the same week. His eyes changed. The memorandum does not explain what Kennedy meant. It does not need to, because it is not the only document of its kind. The shapeshifter classification is the most contested, most ridiculed, and most widely reported category in the entire field of reptilian research. Thousands of eyewitness accounts across 6 decades and dozens of countries describe the same sequence. A person in a position of institutional authority, political, financial, or ecclesiastical, displaying a brief, involuntary physiological shift, vertical pupils, a flicker of something else behind the eyes, a brief moment where the architecture of the face seems to be operating under different instructions, then nothing, back to normal. The witnesses are not always credulous people. Some are journalists, some are security personnel, some are other politicians, and they describe it in the same language across decades without apparent coordination. The biology of biological camouflage on this planet is genuinely extraordinary. The mimic octopus can alter its skin texture, color, and body shape in under 2 seconds to impersonate 14 different species. Cuttlefish have chromatophores, pigment cells, that operate at near neurological speed, changing complex visual patterns faster than a human eye can consciously register. We know these mechanisms exist in cold-blooded animals. We know the genetic machinery for rapid physical alteration is present in reptilian biology. We also know, from the genome research mentioned earlier, that there are genes in the human sequence with no evolutionary origin we can account for. Combining those two facts is not a claim. It is noting what is already documented. Where the official framework collapses is scale. One account of eyes changing can be a trick of light. A dozen can be misperception. At some point, and researchers cataloging these reports reach that point somewhere around the 500th independent account, the volume stops being a data problem and starts being a pattern. Patterns have explanations. Sometimes those explanations are mundane, and sometimes the mundane explanation requires you to accept that something, somewhere along the human timeline, made a modification that most of us are not yet prepared to look at directly. Some of those modifications may be sitting in a room with you right now, and you would never know, because the whole point of a modification that's sophisticated is that you would never know. Here is what you actually just heard, not 7 species. One question, asked 7 different ways across 7 different civilizations, 7 different timelines, and 7 different contexts, always arriving at the same uncomfortable coordinate. something else was here first. It is possibly still here, and it has been interacting with human biology, human governance, and human knowledge in ways we have been persistently trained to dismiss as folklore. The detail introduced at the start of the 1954 Holloman Air Force Base meeting, comes from a specific document, a declassified Canadian government memo written by Wilbert B. Smith, a senior radio engineer with the Canadian Department of Transport, who stated explicitly that UFOs were the most classified subject in the United States. Above the hydrogen bomb, Smith had security clearance. He did not write mythology. He wrote a memo. That memo is in the Canadian National Archive. Go look at it. The question the hook asked, if every major civilization independently described the same category of being, what were they looking at, does not have a clean answer, but it has a structural one. When independent observers in isolated conditions consistently report the same phenomenon, science calls that convergent evidence. When those observers then build religions, governments, and entire cosmologies around what they reported, and all of those systems share a vertical hierarchy with a non-human reptilian intelligence at the top. You are no longer dealing with a cultural quirk. You are dealing with a report, a very long, very consistent, very poorly funded report that has been filed by essentially every human civilization that ever existed. We are apparently not the first intelligent species on this planet to hold a position of authority. We may not be the last. And the 7 types described here are not characters in a mythology. They are a taxonomy. And taxonomies exist because the things inside them are real enough to need sorting.